Welcome to the Oracle Archives. I'm Jennifer, your truth-telling oracle, helping you rise, rebel, and reclaim your power by revealing the truths you weren't taught and the histories they tried to bury. I see this comment everywhere. If Palestinians didn't want this, they shouldn't have chosen Hamas. But that line erases more than a century of occupation, colonization, and control. So today, we're opening the archive. The story begins in 1917. The British Empire, at its height, saw the European Zionist Movement as useful. By backing it, Britain could secure power across Palestine, a strategic corridor between India and the Suez, and keep that same movement from settling anywhere near British soil. From the start, there were no real restrictions, no limits on how many settlers could enter, where they could build, or how they treated the indigenous population already living there. The settlers never came to assimilate or live in harmony. They came to build something entirely their own. And from day one, Palestinians were displaced, deported, and dismissed in their own homeland. Imagine living on your land for generations, and one morning, soldiers from a foreign empire tell you it no longer belongs to you. Imagine being told the people replacing you are divinely entitled to everything you've ever loved. And before anyone watching tries to say, well, they should have fought back, remember, the British Empire and the Zionist settlers had a military. Palestinians were civilians, farmers, teachers, healers, not an army. There was no fair fight. Just empire and occupation. And this is where I always stop and look at us, at Americans and Europeans, because we love to complain about immigrants while forgetting we were the invaders. Immigrants are people fleeing war and oppression. We are the colonizers, the ones who brought both to every shore we touched. We extracted, appropriated, and erased, and then had the audacity to call ourselves civilized. When the Ottoman Empire fell, it was the British who stepped in, a government that didn't speak the language, didn't understand the people, and had no intention of protecting them. Imagine that. A foreign empire decides who gets to live on your land, who gets to stay, and who gets pushed out. The elderly, the sick, children? None of it mattered. The British hand cleared the path for a colonial project that would change everything. It was the British Empire that turned displacement into policy, and 100 years later, people still blame Palestinians for their own dispossession. As a survivor of abuse, I know this pattern well. Abusers create harm, blame their victims, and convince everyone else the violence is their fault. That's exactly what happened here. Israel inherited the empire's logic. Create the problem, punish the victim, and call it self-defense. It's what a violent partner says when he beats his wife and screams, "Look at what you made me do!" Control disguised as protection. And from 1917 onward, this was never about coexistence. It was about control, which brings us to the next layer of this story, the building of an economy designed to exclude Palestinians entirely. Because the goal was never to share the land, it was to build a world where Palestinians existed only as laborers or not at all. Imagine someone arrives on your land, builds cities, farms, and industries, and you're banned from entering, working, or even benefiting in any way. That's not coexistence. That's colonization protected by empire. Anyone who tells you the European Zionist movement meant no harm is lying either to you or themselves. This is where the Jewish National Fund, or JNF, enters the story. Founded in 1901 in honor of Theodor Herzl, the so-called father of European Zionism, the JNF's purpose was simple: buy up land in Palestine and build a Jewish homeland by replacing the people who were already there. The JNF would purchase land from absentee landlords, men who didn't even live in Palestine, and then refuse to rent or sell to Palestinian families, people who had lived, and worked that same soil for generations were suddenly homeless, jobless, and unwelcome in their own country. So now the empire had created two problems at once: a wave of displaced Palestinians and a settler society that saw them as a nuisance. Anyone who looks at that history and blames Palestinians for their suffering has some serious deconstruction work to do. Picture it. The early 1900s, you're a Palestinian child whose family has lived on the same farm for generations. Soldiers you can't even understand show up, and you see fear on your father's face for the very first time. Your mother whispers that you're going on a little adventure, but there's no destination, only displacement. How can anyone know this happened and is still happening and feel nothing? To support genocide is to have forgotten your own humanity. If you can look at oppression and call it justified, your soul is starving for truth. And the only way to heal that is to learn what actually happened and what's still happening now. Because once you control land, you start to control livelihoods. The next phase of this project wasn't about just ownership. It was about economics. And that's where we turn next. Once you control land, you control life itself. When the British handed the keys of Palestine to the Zionist project, they didn't just create settlers, they created an economic hierarchy. By the 1920s and 30s, Jewish settlement agencies and British administrators had built a closed economy. Palestinian labor was replaced, Palestinian exports were blocked, and the taxes Palestinians paid funded the very system that excluded them. Every well, every road, every factory served the new colonies, not the people who'd been there for centuries. Imagine watching your neighbor's farm flourish under protection while your own land lies fenced off behind barbed wire labeled state property. Resistance began early: strikes, boycotts, protests, but the imbalance was impossible to ignore. Britain and the Zionist militias had weapons and global sympathy. Palestinians had their hands, their voices, and faith that justice must one day return. When Britain withdrew in 1948, it left behind chaos. The new Israeli state claimed 78% of Palestine overnight. More than 700,000 people were driven from their homes, the Nakba catastrophe. Entire villages were erased from maps. Families fled with only what they could carry. And those who stayed lived under military rule, their every move dictated by a government that saw them as a demographic threat. Occupation turned life into a series of permissions. Can you travel? Can you work? Can you exist? Every answer required approval from the same power that displaced you. And yet people still loved, planted gardens, wrote poetry, and dreamed. Because resistance isn't only protest, it's surviving in a system built to erase you. By the late 1980s, that survival took a new form. Out of decades of military occupation and broken promises rose movements determined to fight back, some with words, some with weapons. One of them was Hamas, born in 1987 during the first Intifada. And that's where we turn next. By the late 1980s, decades of occupation had boiled over. Out of that pressure came the first Intifada, led by ordinary Palestinians, workers, mothers, students, children with stones in their hands instead of rifles. During that uprising, one faction emerged: Hamas. It began as a community and religious organization focused on social aid, but it quickly became both political and militant. For many Palestinians, Hamas symbolized resistance after generations of abandonment. But this is where the story gets rewritten. Western media didn't show the decades of dispossession that birthed that rage. They showed only the reaction, not the cause. Yes, Hamas has committed acts of violence, and many are war crimes. But acknowledging that truth doesn't erase another: an entire people being punished for existing. Labeling all Palestinians terrorists became the perfect distraction. It excused every bombing, every blockade, every checkpoint. It turned the colonizer into the victim and the victim into the threat. United Nations Commissions of Inquiry said it plainly, quote, "These events were preceded by decades of violence, unlawful occupation, and Israel's denial of the Palestinians' right to self-determination, manifested in continuous forced displacement, blockade, and systematic oppression." So when people say they chose Hamas, they're repeating the abuser's logic. Look what you made me do. And it worked. Because if you convince the world the oppressed are dangerous, you never have to answer for the oppression itself. But here's the truth. No one chooses oppression. And what we call peace can't be built on cages and rubble. What happens when we forget our humanity? When we let fear and politics replace empathy? That's when we start calling survival a crime and occupation a right. Palestinians didn't choose this. They were born into it. Generation after generation inheriting loss and headlines that paint them as monsters for refusing to disappear. But oppression always underestimates the human spirit. You can cage a people, silence them, starve them, but you cannot kill memory. You cannot erase the will to live free. That refusal lives in every child who learns their grandparents' village name, in every artist painting keys on broken walls, in every voice that says, "We are still here." Choosing compassion in a world that profits from cruelty is rebellion. Choosing truth when it's inconvenient is revolution. Choosing to care, that's the beginning of healing. This story was never about religion. It was about control and the courage to speak against it. Here in the Oracle Archives, we don't look away from uncomfortable parts of history. We sit with them because only through truth can we really rebuild. If you made it this far, thank you for listening with an open heart. I'm Jennifer, your truth-telling oracle. Healing is rebellion. Truth-telling is protection. Freedom begins in awareness.